Okay, this next set of videos will be about attention and various attentional mechanisms. So, for example, think about a situation where you're talking to someone boring at a party and your eyes are focused on them while they drone on and on, but you're actually secretly listening to the conversation of the cute person a few feet behind you who's gossiping about a mutual friend. In that case, your brain is actually processing something completely different than what we might assume just by looking at you or what your conversation partner might be assuming. The fact that you can direct your attention towards some things, but not others in a controlled way, that's a pretty powerful cognitive ability. And we're also going to talk about things like multitasking and divided attention, stuff like that. So to start with, we could define attention as something like how we select and process a limited amount of information from all the information available to our senses, our stored memories, and all our other cognitive processes. So this can involve like conscious or unconscious processes. So covertly paying attention to the conversation behind you while faking interest in the one in front of you, that's conscious. You're knowingly choosing to direct your attention in that way. But we'll see other attentional processes doing a lot sort of totally outside of our conscious awareness, or our attention being drawn to something because it shows up in the environment and it's very salient, even though we weren't initially paying attention to it. Now, the reason attention is such a powerful factor in cognition is it lets us focus to use our limited cognitive resources more efficiently. Like, we can't take in every bit of information coming in through our senses every moment out of the day. We don't even notice the background sounds, the details of all the light coming in from our periphs, right? The color of someone's shirt off in the crowd off to our left. We don't notice that stuff, even though it gets into our eye. We don't notice the feeling of our clothes against our skin. Instead, at any given time, we're able to focus our processing, and you might say sort of focus our cognition and our consciousness on a much smaller subset of the information that's available. And another benefit we'll see is it allows us to respond faster and more accurately. Like, you can interact more smoothly with things you're attending to, and it helps us remember things better. Because if we pay attention to something, it actually sticks in our memory much better than the stuff that you're exposed to but didn't pay attention to. Like when you're listening to a talk about cognitive psychology, but your attention isn't really on it because your mind's wandering somewhere else, you won't actually remember any of it very well. That's why it can help a lot to actively take notes when you're learning something new, because it ensures, it kind of forces you to be attending to the information instead of just letting it wash over you uselessly while your attention is elsewhere. Now, there are quite a few topics where cognitive psychologists have studied attention. In this first video, we're going to talk about signal detection, where we're able to detect the appearance of something interesting and important, or maybe fail to do so and miss the signal. Then in the next video, we're going to talk about how attention is involved in search tasks, where you're kind of actively looking for something or scanning for some sort of target amongst a bunch of distractors. And then a lot of cognitive psychologists have studied mechanisms of selective attention, where we're able to kind of filter out or ignore unwanted information to focus our attention on something. And finally, there's the big topic of divided attention, kind of multitasking, basically. The way our brain lets us shift or distribute attentional resources between multiple tasks and the limitations of that. So we'll talk about all this stuff, but for this first video, let's start with signal detection. So as I said, that means detecting the appearance of something interesting or important among other irrelevant stimuli. The classic example of this would be a radiologist or an oncologist, like looking for a tumor on a scan, or a TSA agent in an airport, in the security part of an airport, looking through x-rays for any sort of weapons, but trying not to stop all the time for false alarms because that slows things down and pisses people off, and then you're not good at your job. But this is also what our brain is doing all the time when we're driving and, we either see or maybe don't see a motorcycle or someone on a bike or even another car just coming from an unexpected direction. Or when like a radar operator notices something suspicious on the radar, that's signal detection. Or when we read the headline of a news article posted by a rather credulous friend or uncle and we decide whether that headline we're looking at is real news or fake news, that's signal detection as well. So in signal detection theory, we use some terms for what can happen during this kind of task. So a hit is like detecting a real signal. Like you found the tumor on the x-ray. It didn't slip by, right? On the other hand, a miss would mean failing to detect a real signal. Like you're saying there's no tumor even though there is one. This is the same thing as saying a false negative, for example, if you've heard that term. However, there are other possibilities too. For example, a false alarm where we've concluded there's a signal, but there actually isn't one. In other words, it's a false positive. It's thinking you found a tumor and going forward with a biopsy or surgery or something like that when there's not actually a tumor. This is just another term for a false positive. Finally, sometimes there's no tumor, and that's the conclusion you correctly come to. So that's what we would call a correct rejection. You're correctly concluding that there's no signal. So together, these are the four possibilities. Anytime you're looking for something that may or may not be there, these are the four things that can happen when you come to a conclusion of whether it's there or not. So you'll often see these four possibilities laid out in a table, because then it's kind of easy to see how these cover all four ways it could go. So on the left column, we got the signal either being present or absent. Like in reality, it's either there or it's not. And then along the top row labels, we've got the conclusion we came to during our own signal detection task. Like when we're looking at the scan or the x-ray, did I find a tumor, think I found a tumor, or did I not? So if we just look at the times where a signal is genuinely present, meaning there's actually, say, a weapon, like a box cutter in someone's luggage, if you're a TSA agent, that would be a hit if we do recognize the weapon. We say, hey, I think there's a weapon here. Stop the thing. Go search the luggage. But it would be a miss if there was a box cutter there, but we didn't see it. We didn't stop things and search, right? But other times there's no signal actually there. In other words, there's no box cutter in the luggage. So in that case, if we detect a signal, so we think there's one there and we stop and search them, we've made an error. It's a false alarm. But if we look at the x-ray on this totally safe luggage and conclude, yeah, there's nothing there, moving on, that would be a correct rejection. That's a good thing. So if you've learned some basic inferential statistics, you might recognize that this is directly analogous to the ways we can correctly follow like a solid but imperfect procedure and sometimes still come to the wrong conclusion. So a false alarm would be analogous to a type 1 error in statistics, where you concluded there's an effect, but in reality there isn't one. And a miss, that would be analogous to a type 2 error, where there is a real effect, but we didn't come to that conclusion. We missed it. Now, one reason we make mistakes like false alarms or misses is that even with a good procedure in place, our measurement is often noisy. Like the process itself is messy, the measuring device is imperfect, our brain processes have some randomness and noise to them. So sometimes we won't get it right, even if we're doing everything right. Like imagine a well-trained doctor listening to a patient's lung response for a possible tumor. So now it's kind of an auditory task instead of a visual one, but we're basically trying to detect if the breathing sounds wrong. Now, if there's no tumor, there's still some messiness or noise to the data. In other words, some variation can happen. Like look at just the left distribution on this graph here, the left bump. That could be sort of the range of possible outcomes when the doctor listens in on a no tumor patient. So the whole left graph here is a no tumor patient. Sometimes it doesn't set off any internal alarm bells, right? It's really far to the left. Sometimes it actually sets off quite a bit just due to random noise and variation. So that's kind of the right tail of this leftmost graph. Now, what about when there is a tumor? Well, on average, we're going to be more likely to come to the conclusion that I think there's a tumor there. But even in this situation, there's some randomness, some variation, some noise. Basically, the signal is there for us to detect, but we're detecting a combination of signal plus noise. So look at the rightmost distribution on this graph now, the right part of it. This might be the range of possible outcomes when the doctor listens in on a patient who does have a tumor. Yeah, it's more likely to set off internal alarm bells for the doctor, so we're more likely to conclude there's a tumor when there is one, which is obviously a good thing. The problem is, look at that graph of those two distributions. Sometimes a patient with a tumor will sound the same as a patient without a tumor, even though those with a tumor are more likely on average to cause a larger response. In other words, because information is imperfect and real processes are noisy, tumor or no tumor, measurements often overlap. So one way you might think of this is, I need to come up with some sort of cutoff. Even if it's a little bit arbitrary, I as the doctor need to come up with some sort of cutoff point above which I'm going to conclude there's probably a tumor. Let's go do a biopsy and all this expensive and potentially dangerous stuff. And below my cutoff, I conclude there probably isn't a tumor and we don't go forward. So imagine I set that cutoff at, say, 12.5 on this graph, right? It's just arbitrary units, but I set it at that 12.5 point. Anytime that I get at least that strong of a response, I'm going to say, yeah, there's a tumor. Let's move forward. Imagine that's my rule. Anything above a 12.5, I'll tell the patient they have a tumor. They're going to panic. They're going to talk to their family. They're going to be really scared. Okay, well, look at the rightmost distribution. Of all the people who actually do have tumors, I'm going to catch the vast majority of them. That's good. But that whole big tail off to the left of my cutoff, so it's still part of the right distribution. So people who have tumors, there's still that tail to the left of my cutoff, that ends up as misses. It's falsely giving them a clean bill of health. I'm telling them you don't have a tumor when actually they do. Meanwhile, look at the leftmost distribution of all the people who don't have tumors. So these are healthy people, no tumors. Most of them will be properly given a clean bill of health. That's a correct rejection. That's good. But those in the big tail, kind of to the right to my cutoff, they'll be told they do have a tumor when really they don't. So they'll get a false alarm, a false positive. Now that kind of sucks, right? Because it means a lot of both types of people will get the wrong diagnosis, even though overall most people get the correct diagnosis. What we're talking about here, this idea of a cutoff that we have to decide on, that's called a criterion. It's the criterion for what she or he will conclude is, yep, there's a tumor, do a biopsy, or nope, probably not, don't risk a biopsy. So looking at the distribution of measurements when there is a tumor, the rightmost distribution that we've shaded in here, what you're seeing is how often this particular criterion that we've chosen will correctly detect the tumor, what we call a hit, and how often it'll miss, right? Mistakenly miss a tumor. Now look at the distribution of measurements we've shaded in here when there's not a tumor, and you can see how often this particular criterion, if we put the line here, will end up correctly rejecting, meaning, like, thankfully we conclude there's no tumor because these people don't have tumors, but also how often it'll give false alarms and give someone a huge worry or unnecessary medical procedures or expenses. In other words, all four of our signal detection possibilities can be mapped out here, and our criterion that we choose, so we have some control over where this line goes, the criterion that we choose changes the rate of each of those possibilities, but in a very related way. It's a trade-off. So choosing a different criterion is going to shift those rates, depending on how much you want to avoid missing real tumors or how much you want to avoid false alarms. Like, which do you consider worse, for example? In the top case, the criterion is low. Maybe we said it's a really low criterion, meaning it's very easy to conclude, yeah, there's a tumor, go forward with a biopsy. Which means you will rarely miss a tumor. That's great. But you're going to get tons of false positives, tons of false alarms. And you might think, okay, but that's worth it in order to catch most of the real tumors, right? Except what happens when we're dealing with a really rare condition where tumors aren't that common? In that case, the vast majority of people that we're testing will be no tumor people, right? They'll be the left distribution. It'll be a big ass distribution on the left. And by putting our criterion far to the left, we're going to end up with tens of thousands or tens of millions of false alarms hiding that small number of genuine hits. So we set things up to detect as many tumors as possible, but paradoxically, we're going to end up having more trouble figuring out who actually has a tumor because we flooded ourselves with false alarms. That's a problem if we move the criterion too far to the left, especially if the base rate is low. Now, in the bottom case, the bottom graph here, with that more conservative criterion, you're going to miss a lot of tumors, but you'll have fewer false alarms. No matter what, no matter where we put the criterion, we're going to make mistakes. So it's about finding the right balance or choosing which mistakes we're most worried about. And again, you might want to take into account the base rate of how common the thing is in general, so that we know how badly false alarms might swamp the real hits. Now, choosing a criterion always involves trade-offs. So, Yeah, here we go. So with most real world processes where we're looking for something or listening for something, whether it's looking for a biker in our side mirror or trying to discriminate fake news from real news or trying to find a gun in someone's carry-on if you're TSA, we're always going to have to find a balance, a criterion that'll balance false positives and misses, the two dangers, the two possible mistakes. Another way to think of this is like in the justice system, we have to choose whether to convict or not convict someone who's accused of a crime. But the evidence isn't always perfect and it's a little messy and noisy as a system, so we're going to make mistakes. Sometimes we'll put away innocent people. That sucks. That's a false alarm. And sometimes we won't put away the actual criminals. And that's a miss, right? We didn't capture them. Now, if we set our criterion for conviction really, really low, then it's going to be super easy to get a conviction, which might sound nice, right? It means real criminals won't generally get away. But if we set that bar so low, we'll have tons of innocent people also going to jail. On the other hand, if we set our criterion really high, then it's going to be almost impossible to convict anyone, which means we won't have a lot of false alarms. We won't have many times where an innocent person goes to prison, but we'll also let a lot of criminals get off scot-free. Either way, wherever we put that criterion involves trade-offs. By the way, just to give an applied example, there's a researcher named Teresa Treat. She does a bunch of this stuff. Her lab uses signal detection theory, for example, to study male misperception of sexual interest, just based on like affective or non-affective cues. So she, changes different cues as an independent variable and sees how men might misperceive sexual interest. So basically, her team looks at what sorts of things influence whether men make a mistake and assume sexual interest where it's not there. Like some guy at a bar who has his criterion set really high would basically be oblivious and totally unable to tell even when someone's overtly flirting with him, whereas some asshole who has his criterion set really low might interpret any bit of just friendliness or even tolerance or fake friendliness as if it's sexual interest, and he'll have tons of false positives bothering the shit out of people in the process. Anyway, that's an applied example of signal detection theory. But before we end this video on signal detection, there is one more element that I want to bring up, and that's our ability to keep doing signal detection for a sustained period of time. Like how well a TSA agent can keep paying close attention to x-rays, even when they've been on the shift for a while, and when the signal, like a real weapon, is super rare. So that's a problem we call vigilance, which just means attending to a signal detection task over a long period of time to detect something that's rare or unpredictable. So the most common example of this would be like a military setting watching for a surprise attack, or a sonar operator looking for submarines on the sonar, something like that. Now, researchers got especially interested in studying vigilance in the laboratory because of military applications like this. For example, the most classic study was way back in 1948 by a researcher named Mackworth, where he set up this simple clock-like moving display. It just goes around in short jumps, kind of like a seconds hand does on a clock. This has actually become a common test of vigilance in the lab because it's really easy to set up, and it lets us measure, for example, how a drug like Adderall might affect vigilance, or how sleep deprivation might affect vigilance, or how being distracted affects vigilance, and stuff like that, right? We can use the same task. So in other words, this task that Mackworth came up with, it has become like a standardized way of measuring vigilance as a dependent variable. Like this kind of test has been used for people applying to be radar operators during wartime. So how does it work? What did he do? Basically, the little display, it goes around, like in this example, the red dot here would be going around the circle a little at a time. And what Mackworth did is every once in a while, the dot makes an extra large jump, like it skips an extra dot. And it's easy to see if you're paying close attention. So you can be paying close attention and you just maybe press a button when it happens. But it's pretty easy to miss after a while if your attention is wandering. So the participant is sitting here watching this boring ass display as the red dot just goes around and around and around and around and around and around for minutes and minutes and minutes. And occasionally it skips, right? Occasionally it skips. And to succeed or get paid in this task, right, to do well or to get the radar operator job, they've got to press a button every time the red dot makes a skip over a long period of time, even when the skips only occasionally happen. So I'll show you a quick example, but this one actually, this is a really simple, easy version of it because this one has a lot of skips close together, whereas the real task has like a long time between skips. But like it's really rare, right? You have to stay focused and pay attention over, an hour or more. So let's see what this is like. Oop, I think I just have to play this. There we go. So the red dot's going to start moving in a second here. After the person reads the instructions, they're supposed to just press space bar. So it skipped there. There's a skip. There's a skip. Again, they wouldn't normally be this close together. In the real task, you're doing this for an hour, and it only occasionally happens. So we're studying really how well a human can do something like this over long periods of time. That's the idea of vigilance. So anyway, that's the basic idea. But imagine you had to do this for a couple of hours and the skips only occasionally happen. I'm sure you can see how you might eventually miss some skips during that session. Basically what we've done is take an important real-world task that relies on the cognitive function of attention, and we've created a nice controlled basic version of that task that we can do in the laboratory. And from this, we have a paradigm where we can test interventions, right? Ways to improve vigilance, drugs that might affect vigilance and attention, things like that. And once we've learned what works, we can go apply that to sonar and radar operators or to TSA agents looking at x-rays and radiologists looking at scans all day, and anyone else who has to sustain attention for long periods of time during kind of a signal detection sort of task. In the case of Mackworth's classic study, he measured people's accuracy over a 2-hour session, and what he found is for most humans, performance drops after about 30 minutes on a task. Basically, it's due to fatigue, right? We start to suck after having, an hour of focusing our attention on one thing. So misses and false alarms both go up, which is basically telling us that your full attention wasn't still focused on the task. So when you're trying to stay on task and focus for something like learning, right, learning new material, whether it's from a textbook or a video or whatever, this means it may be helpful to take a break and stretch every once in a while, because otherwise you're going to start missing things, right? You're going to start having misses and also maybe false alarms. By the way, cognitive neuroscientists have also scanned the brain during vigilance tasks, and we find that the most active brain area is the thalamus. That's a subcortical structure below the cortex, below the lobes, tucked under the cerebral cortex layer, kind of closer to the middle of the brain. It's often called the sensory gateway of the brain because most of our sense detectors, like our eyes and ears and skin, send their axons to the thalamus before going to the primary receiving area in the cortex, where it first gets fully processed. So it makes sense that during a task where we're concentrating really hard on the info coming in from our senses, that the sensory gateway would be working on overdrive. But it turns out one other area is important specifically when we're doing a vigilance task, like watching for threats or dangerous stimuli or whatever. So what brain area might you suspect? Maybe pause and take a guess. And turns out it's the amygdala, that area in the limbic system that's important for processing emotion and fear. So it makes sense we've kind of evolved this system to help us look for things that might not show up all the time, but might occasionally show up, like predators, right? Threats, dangerous things, so that we're able to quickly, catch on to them. And we may need to be able to pay attention even during an hour of, foraging. We're primates, right? But just like our monkey cousins, they're foraging in the trees. They got to be able to pay attention and look for something that comes up only rarely. But if that leopard comes up, the monkey needs to be able to detect it, right? They need to be vigilant while, running around the trees, feeding and looking for the food targets they want. Okay, at any rate, that's enough of an introduction to signal detection and vigilance. We're going to end the video here, and in the next one, we're going to look at another attentional process, what we'll call search tasks or active search, like trying to find a specific person in a big crowd. That's a task that utilizes our attention, and studying it in the laboratory has told us a lot about the fundamentals of how attention works in general. So I will see you in the next video.